They did not arrive with an army. They arrived with a spreadsheet. The Cessation Directorate's message was not a threat. It was a finding. Humanity had been run through a model built on 4,211 prior civilizations, and the output was a probability, not a prophecy, because the Directorate did not believe in prophecy. It believed in curve fitting. The curve said humanity would collapse within 140 years regardless of intervention, and because the curve said so, the Directorate had already begun drafting the disposal paperwork. The formal transmission arrived in perfect, unhurried English, the kind of English that had been rehearsed for centuries by a species that found human languages quaint. It classified Earth as a terminal trajectory asset, Category C, non-interventionist. It noted that no further diplomatic contact is required, as outcome variance falls within acceptable modeling tolerance. It attached a courtesy countdown, 140 years, delivered the way a bank delivers a foreclosure notice it has already filed. The countdown itself was appended as a footnote, not a headline, formatted the way an actuarial table formats a life expectancy. A number nobody is meant to react to because it has already been priced into every other decision around it. Analysts spent the first hour searching the transmission for hidden clauses, for leverage, for anything resembling a demand they could refuse. There was nothing to refuse. A demand implies the other party wants something from you. The Directorate wanted nothing. It had simply finished a calculation and was informing the subject of the calculation as a courtesy, the same courtesy a hospital extends when it tells a patient the results are in. Calculator Prime HFY Vol appeared on every major broadcast simultaneously, smiling the specific smile of someone who has already stopped listening. He did not gloat. Gloating would have required him to think humanity mattered enough to gloat at. Instead, he explained, patiently, that the Directorate's models had a documented accuracy rate of 96% across confirmed outcomes, and that humanity's data simply confirmed a pattern the Directorate had seen many times before. He wished humanity a comfortable remaining span. Then the transmission ended and the silence afterward was total because there was nothing left to argue with. You cannot argue with a percentage. One person did not go quiet. Dr. Priya Nair, complexity economist, had spent 11 years arguing that no predictive model of a conscious population could remain accurate once that population learned it was being modeled. And she had spent 11 years being told, gently and then not gently, that her objection was a footnote, not a finding. Her department chair once described her thesis, in a review she was not supposed to see, as technically interesting and professionally irrelevant. She watched HFY Vol's broadcast twice. Then she said the only sentence anyone remembers from that week: their model assumes we don't know we're being modeled. We know now, the curve just broke. Nobody in the room understood what she meant. She did not explain it further because explaining it further would have sounded like a rallying speech, and she did not do rallying speeches. She picked up her coat and asked for access to whatever hardware the Directorate survey drones had left in low orbit, because the drones had not been recalled, and because nobody scavenges a spreadsheet. She did not ask permission from anyone senior to her, because the people senior to her had spent 11 years telling her the objection didn't matter, and she was no longer interested in their opinion of what mattered. She wanted the drones because a model that had never been tested against an aware population was, by definition, untested, and an untested model is not a verdict. It is a hypothesis wearing a verdict's clothing. Marcus Webb met her at the recovery site 4 days later, holding a drive housing the size of a dinner plate and looking like a man who had not slept since the broadcast. He introduced himself by explaining that he was the only Webb in his family who had never once been mistaken for someone famous, which he considered both a professional and personal failure. He was a data engineer who had spent a decade building fraud detection systems for institutions that assumed every user was lying to them. And the moment he opened the drive housing, he stopped talking mid-sentence. The drive was not sensor data. It was training data. Raw, unencrypted, 40,000 years of it, because the Directorate had assumed nothing on Earth could parse alien statistical architecture and had not bothered to secure a discard unit. Webb sat down on the floor of the recovery bay because his legs stopped working correctly, and he did not get up for 11 minutes. When he finally spoke, he said the model was built entirely on historical population behavior. Birth rates, resource curves, conflict frequency. None of it accounted for a population that had just been told explicitly what its own historical curve was. Dr. Ilangovan arrived the next morning to examine the drone's onboard processor, which the recovery team had assumed was ballast because it produced no signal and drew almost no power. She had been introduced to the project as the materials person, a title she rejected on the grounds that she had never in her career met a material that didn't also have to do something. She ran a current through it out of habit rather than expectation, and the processor woke up mid-simulation because it had never actually been off. It had been idling, running the directorate's model continuously and locally, the way a thermostat runs continuously without anyone watching it. It was not ballast. It was a live instance of the exact engine that had condemned Earth, sitting unguarded in a cargo bay because the directorate had never imagined anyone would think to ask it a question. Webb spent the following 6 hours mapping the training set's structure instead of its content, because he had learned, in fraud detection, that the shape of a dataset tells you more than the numbers inside it. What he found was a weighting system that treated every civilization's response to bad news as a fixed personality trait rather than a moving target. Denial, bargaining, collapse in that order, every time, because in 4,211 prior cases it had always gone in that order. The model did not have a category for a species that skipped denial entirely and went straight to reverse engineering the paperwork. It did not have a category because it had never needed one before. Ilangovan's discovery came a full day later, and it was quieter than Webb's, which made it land harder. The processor she had woken up was not simply running the Extinction model. It was running a nested copy of the exact targeting and formation logic used by Directorate warships, because the Directorate built its diplomatic assessments and its combat doctrine from the same core engine, on the theory that a species too disorganized to survive economically was also too disorganized to fight effectively. She traced the shared architecture for 9 hours before she said anything out loud, and when she finally did, it was one sentence. The thing that had condemned Earth and the thing that would eventually be sent to enforce that condemnation were, mathematically, the same object wearing 2 different names. Dr. Emeka Osei joined the team 2 days after Ilangovan, brought in specifically because he had spent his career studying confidence intervals, the margin of error a model admits to when it is being honest with itself. He asked for the Directorate's raw accuracy figures before he asked for anything else, because a 96% accuracy rate only means something once you know what the other 4% looked like. Webb pulled the number. Osei read it once, then read it again, and then he did not speak for almost a full minute, standing very still in the middle of the recovery bay with his hand flat against the housing of the drive. The 4% was not noise. It was a category. Every prior civilization that had defied the model's prediction shared exactly one trait beforehand: contact with their own extinction data before the model finished calculating it. The Directorate had logged the anomaly 4,211 times and had never once flagged it as a variable, because flagging it as a variable would have meant admitting the model's own transmissions were capable of changing the outcome it was measuring. An institution built on trusting its own math does not enjoy discovering that the act of delivering the verdict was itself contaminating the sample. Osei's finding did not feel like a victory when he said it out loud. It felt like reading a coroner's report and finding your own name misfiled among the survivors. 4% of 4,211 was 168 civilizations, every one of them a species that had in some form seen the paperwork early and refused to accept the verdict as final. Humanity was not an anomaly. Humanity was, statistically, exactly the kind of case the Directorate had been quietly failing to predict for tens of thousands of years, and had never corrected for, because correcting for it would have meant admitting the model was not the finished instrument it claimed to be. Webb pulled the historical outcomes of those 168 cases next, because Osei's number was only half a finding until someone showed what happened to the civilizations inside it. 91 of them still collapsed anyway, on schedule, because seeing your own verdict early is not the same as doing anything useful with it. The other 77 diverged from the predicted curve within roughly the same narrow window, a window Webb measured at 11 to 40 days after first contact with their own extinction data. Humanity was on day 4. Whatever advantage came from early exposure to the verdict, it was not permanent and it was not passive. It expired. That detail changed the room. It was not longer a question of whether humanity could outthink the model. It was a question of how much runway remained before humanity quietly reverted to the 91, the ones who saw the paperwork, felt briefly defiant, and collapsed on schedule regardless. Nair heard the number and did not ask for clarification. She asked for the drone processor to be moved to her own lab by that evening. Nair asked it a question. She fed the processor humanity's actual behavior in the 4 days since the broadcast: riots that had not happened, panic buying that had not happened, despair that statistically should have happened and instead had been replaced by the largest coordinated research mobilization in recorded history. The model choked on it, not because the data was corrupted, but because the model had no variable for a population that responded to its own extinction curve by immediately trying to break it. The Directorate's engine had been built to predict populations that didn't know they were populations. It had never once been tested against a population that read its own file. Nair sat with that result for a long time before she said anything, because she understood before anyone else in the room did what it actually meant. The Directorate's fleet was not commanded by improvisers. It was commanded by the same predictive architecture sitting in front of her. Because a civilization that trusts a model enough to issue extinction notices with it trusts that model enough to fly its ships with it too. If the engine in the cargo bay was a copy of the engine flying the fleet, then the fleet's decisions were not decisions. They were outputs, and outputs could be reverse engineered. The Directorate noticed the recalibration probe 11 hours later. Their second transmission was not patient. It was precise in the particular way of an institution that has just discovered an error in its own paperwork and cannot yet admit it publicly. It accused humanity of unauthorized architecture access and revised the courtesy countdown from 140 years to 36 hours, citing accelerated risk profile. Nair read the message once and said the deadline was not a punishment. It was a panic response dressed up as policy, because an institution built entirely on trusting its own model does not know what to do when the model stops agreeing with itself. The revised transmission carried a tone the first one had not, because the first one had been written by an institution that believed its own math, and the second one had been written by an institution that had just watched its math fail in real time and did not yet have a category for that experience either. It cited unauthorized architecture access 3 separate times as though repetition could restore certainty. It offered no negotiation window, no acknowledgement, no smiling face this time. HFY did not appear on the second transmission at all. Nair noted that absence out loud before anyone else did, because an institution that sends its most polished diplomat to deliver good news and its least polished functionary to deliver bad news is an institution that already suspects it is losing the argument. She did not slow down, she sped up. The team spent the next 29 hours feeding the recovered engine a specific kind of data, not about humanity, but about the Directorate's own fleet, its supply doctrine, its risk tolerance, its centuries of confirmed outcomes. If the fleet's tactical decisions were generated by the same model that generated its diplomatic ones, then the fleet would behave exactly the way the model told it to behave, right up until the moment the model was fed something it had never priced in. Webb built the transmission architecture. Ilangovan modified the drone's processor housing to broadcast on the Directorate's own diagnostic frequency, the one channel their sensors were built to trust without question, because nobody encrypts a conversation with their own thermostat. At the 36-hour mark, 7 Directorate cruisers entered high orbit in a standard containment formation. Wide, patient, 7 ships, no fighters, no boarding craft. The model had not allocated combat assets to a target it still rated as a low-resistance probability, and that line item was the entire plan Nair intended to exploit. The transmission went out 4 minutes later. False economic data, engineered to match the confirmation bias the model already trusted, indicating Earth's resource output had begun its terminal decline early. To a model trained on 4,000 prior extinctions, early decline meant no resistance was coming. 4 cruisers moved to salvage spacing. Their coordination relay dropped its defensive envelope to improve broadcast range, because the model calculated that range was worth more than armor against a population it had just confirmed was collapsing. That was the gap Ilangovan had been waiting for. 2 modified recovery drones carrying nothing but a directed pulse rig built from salvaged Directorate components launched at the relay ship. Distance, 400 kilometers. Flight time under 90 seconds. The relay's point-defense grid engaged late because point-defense response time was also a model output, tuned for threats the model expected. It destroyed 1 drone. The second one reached the hull. The pulse did not destroy the relay ship. It did not need to. It severed formation coordination across all 7 cruisers for 11 minutes, and for 11 minutes 6 ships with no independent tactical doctrine did not know what to do because they had never once been asked to decide anything without the model. 1 cruiser broke formation and retreated toward the outer marker. Nair let it go without hesitation, because a witness who reported an anomaly the model could not explain was worth more than a 7th kill. The remaining ships restored coordination at the 11-minute mark and withdrew to standoff range without firing. The engagement, if it could be called that, lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds, and not a single human vessel had been involved. 6 hours later, HFY sent a second message, on a channel that was not the official one. There was a long pause before he spoke, longer than diplomatic protocol required, and when he did speak, his English had lost its rehearsed quality for the first time. "Your species was modeled as reactive," he said. We accounted for adaptation. We did not account for a population that would weaponize the fact of being modeled itself. That was audacious. It was also correct. My assumption was that intelligence and unpredictability were separate variables. I was wrong to treat them as separate. Nair did not answer that transmission personally. She was already 3 hours into drafting the terms she wanted in exchange for a working ceasefire, full historical training data, not filtered summaries. Because raw data was the only version the Directorate couldn't quietly edit later. Webb pointed out that the negotiation could wait until morning. She said the Directorate had spent 40,000 years building the most accurate extinction model in the region, and every hour humanity spent not asking for it was an hour wasted. Webb asked her, somewhere around 4 in the morning, whether she was worried the Directorate would simply refuse the terms and wait out humanity's momentum instead. Nair said no, because an institution that trusted a single model for 40,000 years did not have a second plan sitting in a drawer. It had the model, and the model had just been shown publicly and irreversibly that it could be wrong. An institution like that does not stall. It recalibrates, and recalibration meant they needed better data, and better data meant they needed humanity's cooperation, not its surrender. Ilangovan spent the early morning hours cataloging the recovered processor instead of sleeping, tagging every subsystem the way she tagged every material she had ever tested, by what it could still do rather than what it had been built for. She flagged the formation logic core as the most valuable single object humanity had ever acquired without firing a shot. And she said, without looking up, that she intended to spend the next decade of her career making sure nobody ever again mistook it for ballast. By mid-morning, the terms were drafted. Full unredacted training data, an open channel for continuous exchange rather than periodic bulletins, and a formal Directorate acknowledgement that predictive modeling of a self-aware population required the population's participation, not just its observation. Nair added one more clause herself, in the final version, specifying that any future assessment of Earth include a standing caveat that its behavioral variance could not be treated as noise. It was not a punitive clause. It was a correction, the kind she had spent 11 years trying to get anyone to accept in a peer-reviewed footnote, now written into an interstellar agreement instead. She was still working when the sun came up, sketching out the first draft of a joint predictive framework on the same table where 4 days earlier she had been told her thesis was professionally irrelevant. This was professionally irrelevant.